Chapter 21. In the back room of the laboratory, the white rats in their cages ran and skittered and squeaked. In the corner of a separate cage, a mother rat lay over her litter of blind, naked children and let them suckle, and the mothers stared about nervously and fiercely. In the rattlesnake cage, the snakes lay with their chins resting on their own coils, and they stared straight ahead out of their scowling, dusty black eyes. In another cage, a Gila monster with a skin like a beaded bag reared slowly up and clawed heavily and sluggishly at the wire. The anemones in the aquaria blossomed open and with green and purple tentacles and pale green stomachs. The little sea water pump whirled softly, and the needles of driven water hissed into the tanks, forcing lines of bubbles under the surface. It was the hour of the pearl. Lee Chong brought his garbage cans out to the curb. The bouncer stood on the porch of the Bear Flag and scratched his stomach. Sam Malloy crawled out of the boiler and sat on his wood block and looked at the lightning east. Over on the rocks near Hopkins Marine Station, the sea lions barked monotonously. The old Chinaman came up out of the sea with his dripping basket and flip-flapped up the hill. Then a car turned into Cannery Row, and Doc drove up to the front of the laboratory. His eyes were red, rimmed with fatigue. He moved slowly with tiredness. When the car had stopped, he had sat still for a moment to let the road jumps get out of his nerves. Then he climbed out of the car. At his step on the stairs, the rattlesnakes ran out their tongues and listened with their waving, forking tongues. The rats scampered madly about the cages. Doc climbed the stairs. He looked in wonder at the sagging door and at the broken window. The wariness seemed to go out of him. He stepped quickly inside. Then he went quickly from room to room, stepping around the broken glass. He bent down quickly and picked up a smashed phonograph record and looked at its title. In the kitchen, the spilled grease had turned white on the floor. Doc's eyes flamed red with anger. He sat down on his couch, and his head settled between his shoulders, and his body weaved a little in his rage. Suddenly, he jumped up and turned on the power in his great phonograph. He put on a record and put down the arm. Only a hissing roar came out from the loudspeaker. He lifted the arm, stopped the turntable, and sat down on the couch again. On the stairs, there were bumbling, uncertain footsteps, and through the door came Mac. His face was red. He stood uncertainly in the middle of the room. "Doc," he said. "I and the boys." From the moment Doc hadn't seemed to see him. Now he leaped to his feet. Mac shuffled backward. "Did you do this?" "Well, I and the boys." Doc's small, hard fist whipped out and splashed against Mac's mouth. Doc's eyes shone with the red animal rage. Mac sat down heavily on the floor. Doc's fist was hard and sharp. Mac's lips were split against his teeth, and one front tooth bent sharply inward. "Get up," said Doc. Mac lumbered to his feet. His hands were at his sides. Doc hit him again, a cold, calculated, punishing punch in the mouth. The blood spurted from Mac's lips and ran down his chin. He tried to lick his lips. Put up your hands. Fight, you son of a bitch," Doc cried, and he hit him again and heard the crunch of breaking teeth. Mac's head jolted, but he was braced now so he wouldn't fall, and his hands stayed at his sides. "Go ahead, Doc," he said thickly through his broken lips. "I got it coming." Doc's shoulders sagged with defeat. "You son of a bitch," he said bitterly. "Oh, you dirty son of a bitch." He sat down on the couch and looked at his cut knuckles. Mac sat down in a chair and looked at him. Mac's eyes were wide and full of pain. He didn't even wipe away the blood that flowed down his chin. In Doc's head, the monotonal opening of Monteverde's Jorge el Cielo y la Tierra began to form, the infinitely sad and resigned mourning of Petrarch for Laura. Doc saw Mac's broken mouth through the music that was in his head and in the air. Mac sat perfectly still, almost as though he could hear the music too. Doc glanced at the place where the Monteverde album was, and then he remembered that the phonograph was broken. He got to his feet. "Go wash your face," he said, and went out and down the stairs and across the street to Lee Chong's. Lee wouldn't look at him as he got 2 quarts of beer out of the icebox. He took the money without saying anything. Doc walked back across the street. Mac was in the toilet cleaning his bloody face with wet paper towels. Doc opened a bottle and poured gently into a glass, holding it at an angle so that very clear color rose to the top. He filled a second tall glass and carried the 2 into the front room. Mac came back, dabbing at his mouth with wet toweling. Doc indicated the beer with his head. Now Mac opened his throat and poured down half the glass without swallowing. He sighed explosively and stared into the beer. Doc had already finished his glass. He brought the bottle in and filled both glasses again. He sat down on his couch. "What happened?" he asked. Mac looked at the floor, and a drop of blood fell from his lips into his beer. He mopped his split lips again. "I and the boys wanted to give you a party. We thought you'd be home last night." Doc nodded his head. "I see." "She got out of hand," said Mac. "I don't do no good to say I'm sorry. I've been sorry all my life. This ain't new thing. It's always like this." He swallowed deeply from his glass. "I had a wife," Mac said. "Same thing. Everything I done turned sour. She couldn't stand it anymore. If I done a good thing, it got poisoned up some way. If I give her a present, there was something wrong with it. She only got hurt from me. She couldn't stand it no more. Same thing ever place till I just got to clowning. I don't do nothing but clown no more. Try to make the boys laugh." Doc nodded again. The music was sounding in his head again, complaints and resignation all in one. "I know," he said. "I was glad when you hit me," Mac went on. "I thought to myself, maybe this will teach me. Maybe I'll remember this. But hell, I won't remember nothing. I won't learn nothing." "Doc," Mac cried, "the way I seen it, we was all happy and having a good time. You was glad because we were giving you a party, and we was glad. The way I seen it, it was a good party." He waved his hand at the wreckage on the floor. "Same thing when I was married. I'd think her out and then, but it never come off that way." "I know," said Doc. He opened the second quart of beer and poured the glasses full. "Doc," said Mac, "I and the boys will clean up here, and we'll pay for the stuff that's broke. If it takes us 5 years, we'll pay for it." Doc shook his head slowly and wiped the beer foam from his mustache. "No," he said, "I'll clean it up. I know where everything goes. We'll pay for it, Doc." "No, you won't, Mac," said Doc. "You'll think about it, and it'll worry you for quite a long time, but you won't pay for it. There's maybe $300 in broken museum glass. Don't say you'll pay for it. That will just keep you uneasy. It might be 2 or 3 years before you forgot about it and felt entirely easy again, and you wouldn't pay it anyway." "I guess you're right," said Mac. "God damn it, I know you're right. What can we do?" "I'm over it," said Doc. "Those socks in the mouth got it out of my system. Let's forget it." Mac finished his beer and stood up. "So long, Doc," he said. "So long. Say, Mac, what happened to your wife?" "I don't know," said Mac. "She went away." He walked clumsily down the stairs and crossed over and walked up the lot and up the chicken walk to the Palace Flophouse. Doc watched his progress through the window, and then warily he got a broom from behind the water heater. It took him all day to clean up the mess. Chapter 22. Henry the painter was not French, and his name was not Henry. Also, he was not really a painter. Henry had so steeped himself in stories of the left bank in Paris that he lived there, although he had never been there. Feverishly, he followed in periodicals the Dadaist movements and schisms, the strangely feminine jealousies and religiousness, the obscurantisms of the forming and breaking schools. Regularly, he revolted against outworn techniques and materials. One season, he threw out perspective. Another year, he abandoned red, even as the mother of purple. Finally, he gave up paints entirely. It is not known whether Henry was a good painter or not, for he threw himself so violently into movements that he had very little time left for painting of any kind. About his painting, there is some question. You couldn't judge very much from his productions in different colored chicken feathers and nutshells. But as a boat builder, he was superb. Henry was a wonderful craftsman. He had lived in a tent years ago when he started his boat, and until galley and cabin were complete enough to move in. But once he was housed and dry, he had taken his time on the boat. The boat was sculptured rather than built. It was 35 feet long, and its lines were in constant state of flux. For a while, it had been a clipper boat and a fansail like a destroyer. Another time, it had looked vaguely like a caravel. Since Henry had no money, it sometimes took him months to find a plank or a piece of iron or a dozen brass screws. That was the way he wanted it. For Henry never wanted to finish his boat. It sat among the pine trees on a lot Henry rented for $5 a year. This paid the taxes and satisfied the owner. The boat rested in a cradle on concrete foundations. A rope ladder hung over the side, except when Henry was at home. Then he pulled up the rope ladder and only put it down when guests arrived. His little cabin had a wide padded seat that ran around 3 sides of the room. On this he slept, and on his guests sat. A table folded down when he was needed, and a brass lamp hung from the ceiling. His galley was a marvel of compactness, but every time in it had been the results of months of thought and hard work. Henry was swarthy and morose. He wore a beret long after other people abandoned them. He smoked a calabash pipe, and his dark hair fell about his face. Henry had many friends whom he loosely classified as those who could feed him, and those whom he had to feed. His boat had no name. Henry said he would name it when he was finished. Henry had been living in and building his boat for 10 years. During that time, he had been married twice and had promoted a number of semi-permanent liaisons. And all of these young women had left him for the same reason. The 7-foot cabin was too small for 2 people. They resented bumping their heads when they stood up, and they definitely felt the need for a toilet. Marine toilets obviously would not work in a shore-bound boat, and Henry refused to compromise with the spurious landman's toilet. He and his friend of the moment had to stroll away among the pines, and one after another, his loves left him. Just after the girl he had called Alice left him, a very curious thing happened to Henry. Each time he was left alone, he mourned formally for a while, but actually he felt a sense of relief. He could stretch out in his little cabin. He could eat what he wanted. He was glad to be free of the endless female biologic functions for a while. It had become his custom, each time he was deserted, to buy a gallon of wine, to stretch out on the comfortably hard bunk and get drunk. Sometimes he cried a little all by himself, but it was luxurious stuff, and he usually had a wonderful feeling of well-being from it. He would read Rimbaud aloud with a very bad accent, marveling the while at his fluid speech. It was during one of his ritualistic mornings he lost Alice that the strange thing began to happen. It was night, and his lamp was burning, and he had just barely begun to get drunk when suddenly he knew he was no longer alone. He let his eye wander cautiously up and across the cabin, and there on the other side sat a devilish young man, a dark, handsome young man. His eyes gleamed with cleverness and spirit and energy, and his teeth flashed. There was something very dear and yet very terrible in his face. And beside him sat a golden-haired little boy, hardly more than a baby. The man looked down at the baby, and the baby looked back and laughed delightedly, as though something wonderful were about to happen. Then the man looked over at Henry and smiled, and he glanced back at the baby. From his upper left vest pocket he took an old-fashioned straight-edged razor. He opened it and indicated the child with a gesture of his head. He put a hand among the curls, and the baby laughed gleefully. And then the man tilted the chin and cut the baby's throat, and the baby went right on laughing. But Henry was howling with terror. It took him a long time to realize that neither the man nor the baby was still there. Henry, when his shaking head subsided a little, rushed out of his cabin, leaped over the side of the boat, and hurried away down the hill through the pines. He walked for several hours, and at last he walked down to Cannery Row. Doc was in the basement working on cats when Henry burst in. Doc went on working while Henry told about it, and when it was over, Doc looked closely at him to see how much actual fear and how much theater was there. And it was mostly fear. "Is it a ghost, do you think?" Henry demanded. "Is it some reflection of something that has happened, or is it some Freudian horror out of me, or am I completely nuts? I saw it, I tell you. It happened right in front of me, as plainly as I see you." "I don't know," said Doc. "Well, will you come up with me and see if it comes back?" "No," said Doc. "If I saw it, it might be a ghost, and it would scare me badly because I don't believe in ghosts. And if you saw it again and it didn't, it would be a hallucination and you would be frightened." "But what am I going to do?" Henry asked. "If I see it again, I'll know what's going to happen, and I'm sure I'll die. You see, he doesn't look like a murderer. He looks nice, and the kid looks nice, and neither of them give a damn. But he cut the baby's throat. I saw it." "I don't know," said Doc. "I'm not a psychiatrist or a witch hunter, and I'm not going to start now." A girl's voice called into the basement. "Hi, Doc. Can I come in?" "Come along," said Doc. She was a rather pretty and a very alert girl. Doc introduced her to Henry. "He's got a problem," said Doc. "He either has a ghost or a terrible conscience, and he doesn't know which. Tell her about it, Henry." Henry went over the story again, and the girl's eyes sparkled. "But that's horrible," she said when he finished. "I've never in my life even caught the smell of a ghost. Let's go back up and see if he comes again." Doc watched them go a little sourly. After all, it had been his date. The girl never did see the ghost, but she was fond of Henry, and it was 5 months before the cramped cabin and the lack of a toilet drove her out.